Welcome to Downtown Sports. My name is Downtown Stephen Brown, and in today's video, guys, I want to go over Game 6 against the Tampa Bay Lightning and sort of wrap up that series a bit, but the majority of this video is going to be teeing up what is the Toronto Maple Leafs second round matchup against the Florida Panthers? There's 1,000 different ways that you could come at the Maple Leafs winning their first playoff series in over 19 years, but I'm going to choose to do it in a way that gives the guys who were mostly responsible for it the most credit as possible. Because the Leafs held the Lightning's number one line of Braden Point, Steven Stamkos, and Nikita Kucherov to just two 5-on-5 goals through 6 games, and Point and Kucherov didn't even have one of them. It was Stamkos who had both. And just so everyone understands the significance of that, since Austin Matthews was drafted by the Maple Leafs in 2016, all three of Steven Stamkos, Nikita Kucherov, and Braden Point are in the top 10 in goals scored in the playoffs, with Nikita Kucherov having the most points out of anybody. Those are three of the most dominant scorers in the playoffs in this generation, and the Maple Leafs held them to just 2 goals at 5-on-5 through 6 games. When the Maple Leafs acquired Jake McCabe at this year's trade deadline, they pretty much stabled him to TJ Brody, and that was their shutdown pair. And heading into this series, they were pretty much glued to Braden Point, Steven Stamkos, and Nikita Kucherov. And every single time the Maple Leafs had a face-off in their own zone, and those three guys were on the ice, Sheldon Keefe countered as much as he possibly could with TJ Brody and Jake McCabe, and they were both very successful. And the best thing about Jake McCabe is they got him for 2 more years at just $2 million. But McCabe and Brody weren't the only D pairing that was sensational for the Maple Leafs in that series. Morgan Riley and Luke Schenn were unbelievable, right? Imagine being a Maple Leafs fan on the night of the 2012 entry draft. We already have Luke Schenn in the system. He's labeled as a guy who could be captain material one day, and then the Maple Leafs draft Morgan Riley 5th overall. And you go to bed that night thinking the Maple Leafs number 1 D pairing is going to be Morgan Riley and Luke Schenn for years and years to come. And then Luke Schenn gets traded on the second day of that draft. And here we are 11 years later, and they're one of the main reasons why the Leafs finally won a playoff series. And we had talked about that defensive pairing maybe being something that the Maple Leafs should have been worried about heading to this playoff series because they hadn't played well together the last month and a half of the regular season. And Morgan Riley was kind of having a tough year all season long. But both those guys are gamers. They're gamers. That's the only way you could describe them. I mean, you could look at the numbers, you could look at the expected goals, the scoring opportunities, the zone starts, you could break it all down. Those guys are gamers. They won Morgan Riley's minutes 9 goals for to 3 goals against. Luke Schenn was only on the ice for 1 goal against in the entire series. And I even think he saved a goal in Game 6 by tying up, I believe, Steven Stamkos at the side of the net when there was a loose puck in the crease. And that's just the defensive pairings. We haven't even mentioned the forwards yet. The Maple Leafs won that series in probably the most satisfying way that they possibly could have. Because Mitch Marner was second in playoff scoring with 11 points in 6 games. Austin Matthews had 5 goals in 6 games and scored 2 absolutely massive ones in the Game 4 comeback. Scored 1 late in Game 5 and then opened the scoring in Game 6. John Tavares had that hat trick back in Game 2 and then won the series in overtime in Game 6. William Nylander was good in this series. He had his ups and downs, especially to start Game 4, right? He took that tripping penalty on Steven Stamkos, and the Lightning ended up scoring on that power play. But he really roared back in the third period of that game and in overtime, picking up 2 assists in the third period, an assist on the overtime winner, drew the penalty that put them on the power play that allowed them to score that goal. You know, Ryan O'Reilly tied Game 3 with like a minute left. There's just so many nice things that you could say about the best players on this team. We haven't even mentioned Matthew Knies yet, who came into this series not playing in Game 1, gets thrown into the lineup in Game 2, and then just instantly is one of the Maple Leafs' top 6 or top 9 forwards and is never coming out of the lineup again. He was on the ice for O'Reilly's game-tying goal in Game 3. He was on the ice for Riley's Game 3 winner. He saved a goal in Game 4 and then was on the ice for Kerfoot's overtime winner. And then he was on the ice doing really good work down low for Tavares' series-winning goal in Game 6. When I tell you that there's 1,000 different ways that you could come at the Maple Leafs winning this series, there might even be more. They won this series in the most satisfying way possible. There's just so many things to love about this team right now. And we haven't even mentioned Ilya Samsonov yet, right? Who outdueled Andrei Vasilevsky, the best goaltender in the entire world, in 4 out of the 6 games in that series. And look, the Maple Leafs hadn't had a clutch performance from one of their goaltenders in an elimination game in a very long time, probably since Curtis Joseph or Ed Belfour. And they had an opportunity to close out the Lightning in Game 5, and Ilya Samsonov with a .919 save percentage in that game was not the reason why they had to go back to Tampa Bay in the first place. But then he follows up that performance by stopping 31 of 32 in Game 6 and just being absolute nails for this team. But that was just 4 wins. They're only a quarter of the way there, right? And I don't think Leaf fans need to be reminded that they're only a quarter of the way there. It's just been 19 years. I know I've said it a couple of times now, but trust me, when I said that they won this series in the most satisfying way possible, I'm also including stuff that happened outside of games between the Lightning and the Leafs, right? Because not only did the Leafs come back from a 4-1 deficit in a playoff game and then win in overtime, but the Boston Bruins also blew a 3-1 series lead to the Panthers, who the Leafs will be taking on in the second round. And yeah, the Panthers are the lowest seeded team in this year's playoffs, but they're not to be underestimated. They just knocked off a historically good Boston Bruins team. And if you break down their season and you look at how they performed in the first half of it versus the second half, once the calendar flipped over to 2023, the Panthers had just 3 less points in the same number of games as the Leafs. And then if you want to look at their record since the trade deadline this year, so since the beginning of March, because they had to win a lot of games just to get into this year's playoffs, they were actually better than the Maple Leafs in terms of points percentage and were a top 10 team in the NHL while everyone else around them had loaded up at the deadline and they didn't make a single move. And they were able to accomplish that by completely revamping their entire power play. When the calendar flipped from 2022 to 2023, their power play went from being mediocre, one of the worst in the league, to one of, if not the best in the entire NHL. And for context here, the Edmonton Oilers power play this season has been talked about possibly being the best ever. And in 2023, the Florida Panthers had a higher expected goals for per 60 rating on their power play than what the Oilers did. The Oilers were second, the Panthers were first. And to ensure that they're getting that ridiculous power play on the ice as much as possible, the Panthers play an instigating style of game where they try to take advantage of the referees who usually try to even up the number of power plays that both teams get throughout a game. The Panthers took the most penalties in the entire regular season out of any NHL team, but they also drew the 3rd most power play opportunities. But as I was flicking through those 2 stats there, maybe some of you noticed that the Tampa Bay Lightning also employ the same sort of strategy. And they've sort of been the kings at doing that over the last 3 or 4 years where they've enjoyed a lot of success. The difference between Tampa Bay and Florida, though, is that the Lightning will happily trade power play opportunities with you because they have Andrei Vasilevsky in net. They're confident that they can kill off the penalties that they take, and their power play, chances are, is going to be just as good, if not better than yours. Whereas Florida has Sergei Bobrovsky and Alex Lyon in net, and while I don't want to underestimate anybody, you can see why the strategy maybe works a bit better for one team than the other. But in saying that, I felt like the Leafs handled Tampa Bay and their shenanigans after the whistle a lot better as the series went on. You know, after game 2, I really didn't notice Corey Perry very much, and Pat Maroon really was not very effective. And while maybe the Florida Panthers don't have as much depth as the Tampa Bay Lightning do, both up front and on their blue line, they have something that the Tampa Bay Lightning didn't have this year, and that's a Hart Trophy candidate with Matthew Tkachuk. No disrespect to any of the guys on the Lightning. You know, we talked about how good Nikita Kucherov, Braden Point, and Steven Stamkos had been in the playoffs over the last 6-7 years or whatever, but if Connor McDavid wasn't putting up complete video game numbers this season, Matthew Tkachuk would 100% win the Hart Trophy. This swing in their offense when Matthew Tkachuk is on the ice compared to when he's not on the ice is the largest I have ever seen. There's so many goofy stats that you could talk about when it comes to Connor McDavid. Like, he's got more 3-point games this year than he does games with 0. He leads the NHL in terms of multi-point games. But the guy who's second on that list in terms of multi-point games this season, Matthew Tkachuk. The key to winning this series for the Toronto Maple Leafs will be trying to find a way to shut down one of the best players in the NHL this year. And then if you're looking on their blue line, Aaron Ekblad and Gustav Forsling is going to be their number one shutdown pair. Those two guys more than likely going to be playing the majority of their minutes against Austin Matthews. But beyond that, it's a bit weak. But Brandon Montour, who had a ridiculous Game 7 against the Boston Bruins, scoring early on in it and then tying the game late, kind of gets lost in the weeds and plays up against softer matchups where the Panthers are able to take advantage of his insane offensive ability. That being said, not the greatest defensive defenseman, so the Maple Leafs will need to counter, and their depth is going to play a huge part in winning this series. But I also don't want to make it sound like it's Matthew Tkachuk and then a bunch of bums on the Florida Panthers. No, that's not the case. Sasha Barkov is a really good player. We talked about Brandon Montour already. Carter Verhaeghe scored 40 goals this season. Sam Reinhart is a good player who scored 30 goals for them. The Panthers have good depth players. Sam Bennett as well. I just think that the Leafs have better ones. I don't quite know how to word what I'm trying to say here perfectly, but I'm just going to trust that you're going to understand what I'm trying to get across and not twist my words completely in the comment section, because by no means am I trying to take anything away from the Panthers. I'm just trying to dial it back a little bit here so that we're not pretending that these guys are boogeymen, for beating the 65-win, historically good Boston Bruins team. Yes, they deserve credit for doing so, just like the Leafs deserve credit for beating a Lightning team that wasn't necessarily at 100%. Hedman dealt with injuries throughout that series. They didn't have Cernak in the lineup beyond game 1. Who knows what other stuff they were dealing with. But Patrice Bergeron playing through a herniated disc, only getting into 3 games. Krejci only playing 4 games. That's their top 2 centermen. And while the Bruins are still really good outside of those 2 players, they're very important pieces to that team. Even Linus Ullmark, the goalie who's more than likely going to win the Vezina Trophy this year, was receiving treatment in between his starts, and he didn't play very well in that series. What I'm trying to say is that the Panthers don't have a better team on paper than what the Bruins did. They didn't necessarily play better than them in that series. They were just the healthier team. And more often than not, that's usually what the playoffs come down to. And that was sort of the narrative for both the Lightning and the Bruins heading into this year's playoffs, with the Lightning having played a ridiculous amount of games over the last 3 or 4 years, and it finally caught up to them in this series against the Leafs. And for the Bruins, the narrative almost all season long was, yeah, they're really, really good in December, January, and February, but can this aging veteran core keep it together as you get deeper into April and May? And they just kind of couldn't do it. They fell apart. If the Maple Leafs can establish their game and not stray from it, if they can stay out of the penalty box, if they can use their depth to their advantage, and they can get key performances from the same guys that they leaned on in round 1, I don't see why they shouldn't beat the Florida Panthers in this series. They're the odds-on favorite, and if you asked Florida Panthers fans, they would probably tell you the same thing. But both teams are running on a bit of magic right now, and you can't discount that. And I don't know what other wacky thing we'd do if the Leafs won another playoff series, but This one gets underway Tuesday night in Toronto. They do have home ice advantage, and all I can really say is let the best team win. So make sure to like the video if you did like it, and subscribe for more, because more is always on the way. Give a couple rubs for good luck there, and go Leafs go.